Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about access to publicly available data based on Article 40, paragraph 12 of the Digital Services Act. My name is Elka. I coordinate the DSA 40 Data Access Collaboratory, which you can also reach at the website. And we are a joint project by the European New School of Digital Studies and the Weizenbaum Institute, which are based in Frankfurt-Oder and Berlin, respectively. And we have four goals. Basically, we look at the way that DSA Article 40 is implemented. We consult various stakeholders from science, civil society, and politics. We also support and coordinate and co-author our own data access applications. And we also provide information and networking opportunities for the scientific community, which is what we're doing right now. We're giving you information about how to access data. So the DSA actually includes a bunch of transparency obligations that platforms have to fulfill with different forms of data access also. But however, we are focusing today on the access to publicly available data, which is set out in Article 40.12. So let's jump right in and see what it actually says. A lot of text, so let's try to get through this together. It says, providers of very large online platforms or search engines shall give access without undue delay to data, including, where technically possible, to real-time data, provided that the data is publicly accessible in their online interface by researchers, including those affiliated to not-for-profit bodies, organizations, and associations who comply with the conditions set out in paragraph 8, points B, C, D, and E, and who use the data solely for performing research that contributes to the detection, identification, and understanding of systemic risks in the European Union pursuant to Article 34.1. That's quite a mouthful, and it has a lot of information in it. So let's break it down by going through it step by step. So we start with the information about who is actually supposed to provide data access, and it's the so-called providers of very large online platforms or search engines. What are these very large online platforms or search engines? Well, these are services that store or disseminate information to the public and who have more than 45 million recipients of the service in the EU per month, which basically means that the platform is being used by more or at least 10% of EU citizens. And I'm recording this in late March 2025, and I've listed the providers and their platforms who are currently designated for as VLOPs on the slide. Interestingly enough, just as like some additional information, the EU Commission has of today also initiated proceedings against some of these platforms because their behavior might actually violate the DSA or might not be in compliance with the DSA. I've marked them in italics, so namely it's AliExpress, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Temu, and X, against whom proceedings have been initiated. So we know what platforms are supposed to provide data, but what kind of data do they have to provide? Well, according to Article 40.12, very large online platforms and search engines have to give access to data that is publicly accessible in their online interface. Well, what does it mean? Currently, it's understood in the way as public metadata, meaning likes, shares, like amounts of comments, the metadata that you would usually see on the user interface also. But there's actually no clear guidance on how big the scope of this actually is. And also, it should, if possible, include real-time data. So this is the kind of data that you're supposed to be able to access based on this paragraph. Interestingly enough, access should also be granted without undue delay, so you should not be stuck in the application process for ages. And while it's only implicitly stated here, the access is granted directly by the platforms, which means that you have to apply to them directly through the application forms that they provide. So who can actually use these forms? The text says researchers, as long as they are affiliated with not-for-profit bodies, organizations, and associations, which basically means people who conduct their research for public academic institutions or non-profit organizations. The text also says, however, that these researchers need to meet the specific requirements which are set out in paragraph 8 of Article 40. So let's quickly see what paragraph 8 Article 40 says. It basically says that they have to meet 4 conditions, right? They have to be independent of commercial interests and disclose the funding of the application, which is fair enough, but might already be a challenge for journalists, for example, who tend to not be completely independent from commercial interests as part of their work. Other civil society organizations, however, who are like just funded and kind of do not have an ulterior profit motive, should definitely be covered here. So what else do we have? We also see that researchers need to be capable of fulfilling the specific data security and confidentiality requirements corresponding to each request and to protect personal data. And they describe in their request the appropriate technical and organizational measures. I put this in italics because this requires knowledge of data security and data privacy, which you listening to this video or watching this video might not have. So I'm going to just drop some keywords here, which I would encourage you to look up in this context, which are purpose limitation, storage duration and storage location, data minimization, and access control. And generally, if you are thinking of doing your own data access application, perhaps already start thinking about who in your organization might be a good person to talk to with regards to data security and data privacy. And then obviously there's the last point, which says the application demonstrates that their access to the data and the timeframes requested are necessary for and proportionate to the purposes of their research, and that the expected results of that research will contribute to addressing systemic risk. We'll come back to the systemic risk thing later, but I think here the most important point is to highlight that they need to be necessary for and proportionate to the purposes of their research, so they cannot just request any data, but it needs to somehow relate to the research in general. Talking about systemic risk, this actually comes up as the last part of this paragraph, right? Where it says like data access is granted on the condition that the data is used solely for research on systemic risk in the EU defined in Article 34.1. So that's actually quite important. Research must focus on systemic risk in the European Union, which means the DSA, for example, does not provide the basis to research systemic risk in Brazil, for example. But what is systemic risk even? So for that, we have to once again look at a different article, this time Article 34.1. So let's take a look. Article 34.1 actually has nothing to do with data access itself. It actually focuses more on the requirements that providers of large online platforms have to meet with regards to their risk assessment. And in that context, it names 4 categories of systemic risks which have to be considered by the platforms. And those are the dissemination of illegal content, which, interestingly enough, the DSA itself has no definition of what illegal content actually means, and therefore kind of we have to go back to what EU law or national EU member state law actually defines as illegal, right? So this might be terrorist content, this might be CSAM materials, different kinds of content which might be banned in individual states. For example, Germany has quite strong regulations when it comes to like Nazi symbolism and stuff. Another category is actual or foreseeable negative effects for the exercise of fundamental rights. And this is quite a broad category, right? While the article itself names fundamental rights to human dignity, to respect for private and family life, to the protection of personal data, to the freedom of expression and information, to non-discrimination, to the rights of the child, and to a high level of consumer protection in particular, you could see this relating to all kinds of fundamental rights enshrined in the Charter of the European Union, which, might relate to quite a lot of things. So if you manage to kind of relate your risk research to one of these fundamental rights, it should also be covered. Another category is any actual or foreseeable negative effects on civic discourse and electoral processes and public security, and also actual or foreseeable negative effects in relation to gender-based violence, the protection of public health and minors, and serious negative consequences to the person's physical and mental well-being. So there's a few things which are important to understand about these categories. For one, these are minimal examples, which basically means, as I already said, that these are the categories which providers of very large online platforms have to take a look at in their risk assessments. It does not mean that they cover systemic risks completely. So if you can make a convincing argument that you're still looking at systemic risk, it should theoretically also be covered by the DSA. And it's also interesting to consider the range that these risks have, right? So we're going from negative consequences to a person's physical and mental well-being, right? So the very individual level to negative consequence on civic discourse and electoral processes, right? So like very abstract societal constructs, right? So, or fundamental rights even, right? So we have quite an extensive range that is covered by this definition of systemic risk. But now if we go back to the article, we actually run into a paradox. And where's the paradox here? Well, we have a seemingly quite narrow purpose limitation, right? As the article says, the data must be used solely for research purposes around systemic risk. But then we have a very broad concept of systemic risk. So how do we reconcile this? And my proposition would be to consider the risk governance literature, which I kind of put up here, like especially the IRGC risk governance framework from 2017. And why would I say that we look at risk governance and not just risk management? Well, because risk governance is this multi-agent process, right, which has various stages and kind of tries to get at risk-related decision-making from a participatory framework, which, in my understanding, aligns very closely to the DSA, which also includes various actors in the kind of knowledge creation and decision-making process around systemic risks, right? So the platforms have to manage, the regulators oversee the entire thing, and the researchers are investigating this, right? So if we now look at this fairly popular IRGC risk governance framework, we see four main stages and some cross-cutting aspects, but let's focus on the four main stages for the sake of this video. So before taking any specific risk-related action, the risk needs to be addressed and framed as part of pre-assessment, at best by engaging all relevant stakeholders in goal setting and establishing consensus on the existing evidence. Then the next stage would be appraisal, right? Which actually consists of both risk assessment and concern assessment. In risk assessment, you try to estimate the risk in question and to evaluate it based on state-of-the-art and interdisciplinary scientific methodologies. In concern assessment, you actually try to inform risk assessment and to understand how ambiguous a risk is by surveying the different stakeholders, perspectives, concerns, and questions about the set risk. During characterization and evaluation, the results from the previous stages are assessed with regards to the preset criteria and risk characteristics in order to determine if a risk is deemed either acceptable or unacceptable, which means that you definitely need to take some action. And this action is then kind of decided on as part of risk management, right? Which involves making a decision on which strategy to pursue when mitigating a risk. And how to implement it, right? And so any kind of risk management measure should be periodically reviewed and monitored with regard to its effectiveness and kind of to make adjustments, right? And so we kind of close the circle where we kind of evaluate the risk, make a decision on the risk, and then start kind of gathering information again. So how can we map the task that the Article 4012 sets out for researchers onto this framework? Well, I would argue that if we identify a risk, we are basically in the realm of pre-assessment. Researchers frame the risk by considering what is a risk in the first place, right? By bringing up new risks, by bringing up new facets of risks, and by looking at how management decisions might have affected different risks. And we also can map the detection process, I think, quite nicely onto this, because when researchers detect the risk, they are engaging in risk assessment, characterization, and evaluation, right? They figure out how to measure it, and they try to see how these measurements translate into acceptability judgments. So we have identification and detection covered, but what about understanding of systemic risks? Well, luckily for us, this framework actually differentiates quite clearly into deciding and understanding. So this basically means that while platforms have to manage risks, right, and make decisions on how to react, it's the researcher's responsibility to explore what different risks exist and how they fit into the overall digital ecosystem, right? Risk governance, therefore, always oscillates between high and low perceived uncertainty, right? Obviously, uncertainty is always there, but in order to make a decision, providers of VLOPs need to narrow it down somehow, right? And research needs to exist between these two extremes, right? It needs to acknowledge that there is a lot we don't know, while at the same time coming up with ideas of how to reduce some of it as uncertainty, for example, through suggested means of measurement, right? Thus, while the purpose limitation of Article 4012 might seem narrow at first glance, risk governance actually requires a broad conception of systemic risk research to work and to enable well-founded decision-making. So that was quite a lot. So let's kind of summarize all of this, right? And to summarize this, I'm going to kind of draw on a phrase that German law students use when they first start their studies. And it's called Wer will was von wem woraus, which can basically be translated into who wants what from whom and on what basis. So who wants what? Well, we got non-profit researchers, right, which fulfill the relevant criteria laid out in Article 48 B2E. What do they want? They want data publicly accessible through the platform's interface, at best, in real time. From whom? Well, they want it from the providers of very large online platforms. And on what basis? Well, for the detection, identification, understanding of systemic risk inside the European Union, right? Which, even though it's limited to the European Union, is still quite broad, as I tried to show with regard to the risk governance framework. And all of this is based on Article 4012 DSA. So, thank you for listening. I hope you learned something from this video, and I hope that you're now ready to make your own data access request. If you're in need of more information, be sure to check out our website, where you'll find a more in-depth FAQ and more information about researcher data access based on the DSA. And if that still doesn't answer your questions, you can always contact us. Have a great day, and keep asking for data access.